There are things a mother knows that she will never be asked to explain, because the knowing of them is not the kind of knowing that fits inside an explanation. It is not knowledge that was taught or learned or arrived at through any process that could be retraced and described. It lives in a place that is older than language, older than thought, in the part of a person that is connected to another person before either of them has words for the connection. And it does not diminish with time or distance or the accumulation of years or the ordinary wearing down of life. A mother knows her child. She knows what her child is capable of and what her child is not capable of, and what her child has done and what her child could never have done, and what her child is carrying in the dark hours when they think they are alone with it. She knows all of this the way she knows the sound of her own heartbeat, without trying, without being able to stop knowing it even if she wanted to. Miriam Aldcott knew her daughter. She had known Grace since the moment of her birth in the spring of 1729, when Grace had come into the world in the upper room of their house on the southern edge of Tidebell, South Carolina colony, with the specific and determined quality that she would carry for the rest of her life. The quality of a person who arrives at things with their whole self and does not do anything by half measure. Miriam had looked at her daughter in those first hours and had understood, with the completeness of the maternal knowing that has no adequate description, that this child was going to need more protecting than most. Not because Grace was weak, because Grace was the opposite of weak, because the same quality that made her extraordinary would, in a world that had very particular ideas about what a young woman in colonial Carolina was, and was not permitted to be, make her dangerous to herself in ways she would not see coming until they had already arrived. Miriam had spent 19 years protecting Grace with the specific, unannounced competence of a woman who has decided that the protecting is her primary work, and who does it so quietly and so completely that the person being protected does not fully understand what has been standing between them and certain consequences. She had protected her from the judgment of the women of Tidebell who found Grace's directness uncomfortable. She had protected her from the expectations of a colonial society that wanted her to be smaller and quieter and less present in the world than Grace had any intention of being. She had protected her from the specific danger of men who saw Grace's combination of beauty and self-possession as a challenge, and who responded to challenges in ways that Miriam understood and Grace, at 19, did not yet fully appreciate. She had not been able to protect her from Edmund Wraith. Edmund Wraith was 38 years old, a merchant of the second tier of Tidebell's commercial hierarchy, a man who dealt in the provisioning of the coastal vessels that used the harbor and who had, over a decade of careful accumulation, built a position in the town's trade that was substantial without being quite prominent, visible without being quite distinguished. He was a man who operated in the spaces between the larger merchants and the smaller ones, filling gaps that the grander operations were too important to bother with, and that the smaller ones lacked the resources to service. And he had developed in this position a competence that was real and a resentment of those above him in the hierarchy that was equally real, and that he managed, in public, with the smooth courtesy of a man who understands that expressed resentment is commercially counterproductive. He had begun pursuing Grace in the autumn of 1747, when she was 18 years old, with the specific, patient attention of a man who has decided he wants something and is willing to invest the necessary time in acquiring it. He had called at the Aldcott house. He had presented himself at the social occasions where Grace was present. He had been pleasant and correct and attentive in the ways that a man pursuing a young woman in colonial Carolina was expected to be pleasant and correct and attentive. And he had done it with sufficient skill that the people around them had begun to speak of the match as a likely one, and Grace had not yet understood what was beneath the pleasantness. Miriam had understood. She had understood from the third time Edmund Wraith called at their house, from something in the quality of his attention to Grace that was not what it appeared to be. That was not the attention of a man who valued the person he was looking at, but the attention of a man who valued the idea of possessing what he was looking at. She had seen this distinction before. She knew it the way she knew the distinction between wood that is sound and wood that has rot beneath its surface, by a quality she could not entirely articulate but that she trusted completely. She had said nothing to Grace, not directly. She had tried, in the oblique way of a mother who understands that a daughter of Grace's character responds to direct opposition by moving toward the thing being opposed, to introduce a sufficient quantity of doubt and observation into Grace's awareness of Edmund Wraith, that Grace would arrive at her own reservations through her own process. This had not worked quickly enough. In February of 1748, Edmund Wraith asked Miriam's husband, a man named Robert Aldcott who managed a small carpentry and boat repair business on the northern edge of the harbor, for Grace's hand in marriage. Robert, who was a man of genuine kindness and limited perceptiveness about the specific quality of people that Miriam had always been able to read that he could not, found Wraith's suit reasonable and said he would speak with Grace. Miriam said she thought Grace should be given time to consider. Robert said, of course. The time to consider stretched through March and into April, and Grace, who had been flattered by Wraith's attention and who had not yet seen what her mother had seen, was moving, in the way of a young woman who has not been given a specific reason to move away from something, toward a yes. It was in April of 1748 that Grace saw what her mother had seen. She did not tell Miriam what happened. She did not tell Robert. She did not tell anyone, because what happened was the kind of thing that a young woman in Colonial Carolina in 1748 had very few safe ways of telling. And Grace understood this with the specific understanding of a person who has grown up in a world where understanding the rules of that world is a survival skill, even when those rules are unjust. She withdrew from Edmund Wraith's suit without explanation, with the quiet firmness of a young woman who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. Wraith accepted the withdrawal with a graciousness that was, Miriam noted, too complete to be genuine, the graciousness of a man who has decided that the current approach has not worked and who is revising his strategy rather than accepting his defeat. Miriam watched Grace in the weeks after the withdrawal with the specific attentiveness of a mother who knows something has happened and who is waiting for Grace to be ready to tell it. And she saw in her daughter the particular quality of a person carrying something heavy alone, the specific stillness of someone who has decided that the carrying is theirs to do, and is doing it without complaint and without sharing the weight. She did not press. She made herself available and she waited and she watched, and she carried alongside her daughter the knowledge that something had happened without knowing its specific shape. What she knew, from the shape of Grace's withdrawal and the specific quality of Wraith's too gracious acceptance, was that whatever had happened between them had given Wraith something, some knowledge or some claim, that he had decided to hold rather than use immediately, and that the holding of it was a kind of power he intended to exercise at the time of his choosing. She was right. He exercised it in September of 1748. The death of a man named Cornelius Vane was discovered on the morning of the 14th of September, 1748, by his housekeeper, who came to open the merchant's house on the eastern side of Tidebell's harbor front and found Vane dead in his study, the room in considerable disorder, and the strongbox behind the studies, false panel open and emptied of its contents, which were understood by those who knew Vane's business to be substantial. Cornelius Vane was 61 years old, a senior merchant of Tidebell whose trading operation was one of the largest in the harbor, and whose personal character was, in the assessment of those who had dealt with him closely over the years, somewhat less admirable than his commercial success. He was a man who had built his position partly through genuine commercial skill and partly through practices that were not illegal in their form, but were close enough to the edge of what could be defended, as honest that the people who had been on the receiving end of them found the distinction meaningless. He was not mourned as fully as a man of his standing might have expected. He was mourned as a man whose death was a matter of consequence regardless of how one felt about the man himself, because consequence and feeling are different things, and the people of Tidebell were practical enough to know it. the Colonial magistrate, a man named Mr. Josiah Hart, who had held the position for 12 years, and who discharged its responsibilities with the specific thoroughness of a man who took the position seriously, and the specific limitation of a man who had the tools of colonial justice available to him and no others, began his investigation with the information that was immediately available. The study showed signs of a struggle. Vane had died from a blow to the head. The physician's assessment was clear on this point. The strongbox had been emptied. The house's back entrance had been found unlocked from the inside, suggesting that whoever had been in the study had known the house well enough to know the back entrance and to have had access to it. Wraith came forward on the third day of the investigation. He came forward not as a suspect, but as a witness, which was a distinction that Magistrate Hart received with the professional attention it deserved, and that the people of Tidebell received with the less professional but equally attentive interest of a community observing a situation that contained several overlapping layers of interest. Wraith said, in his statement to Hart, that he had information relevant to the investigation. He said he had observed, on the evening of the 13th, a young woman leaving the rear of the Vane property at an hour that was late enough to be remarkable. He said he had not initially connected this observation to the following morning's discovery, but that on reflection he felt it was his civic duty to report it. He said the young woman he had observed was Grace Aldcott. Miriam heard what Wraith had said to Hart before Grace did, through the specific information network of a small coastal town, where news moves faster than the people carrying it. She heard it and sat down in the kitchen of the Aldcott house, and held the information in her hands like something that could break if she moved too quickly. And she thought, with the focused and absolute clarity of a woman who understands that the next decision she makes is the most important one of her life, about what she knew and what she did not know, and what she needed to do. What she knew was this: Grace had been somewhere on the night of the 13th of September that she had not told Miriam about. She knew this not from evidence but from the specific quality of Grace's behavior in the 3 days since Vane's death was discovered. The quality of a person who is frightened in a way that is specific rather than general, frightened not by the abstract news of a death in the community, but by something that connects the news to themselves. She knew that whatever had passed between Grace and Edmund, Wraith in April, was the mechanism by which Wraith had known to name Grace. Because Wraith did not do things without a reason, and the reason here was not civic duty, but the exercise of the claim he had been holding since April. She knew that a young woman in Colonial Carolina accused of robbery and murder, on the testimony of a man of Wraith's standing, had very little legal protection available to her, and a very large probability of a very bad outcome. What she did not know was whether Grace had been at the Vane property, whether Grace had anything to do with what had happened there. She did not know this, and she could not ask Grace directly, because to ask directly was to place Grace in the position of either confessing to her mother or lying to her mother, and either of those outcomes was worse than the not knowing. The not knowing was something Miriam could carry. The knowing, in either direction, would change what she could do. She made her decision in the kitchen of the Aldcott house in the space of the time it took the kettle to boil, which was not because the decision was easy, but because the decision was, at its foundation, not actually a decision at all. It was the only thing a mother in her position, with her knowledge and her love and her specific and absolute understanding of what was coming for her daughter if nothing intervened, could do. It was not a choice between options. It was a recognition of what had always been true, which was that she would do anything for Grace, and that anything had arrived. She went to Magistrate Hart that afternoon. She told him she had information relevant to the investigation. She told him, in the specific and detailed language of a woman who has prepared what she is going to say with great care, that she had been at the Vane property on the evening of the 13th of September. She told him she had gone there to speak with Vane about a debt she specified in plausible detail, a debt of the kind that a woman in her position might plausibly have with a merchant of Vane's type, the kind of small commercial obligation that the harbor's business economy generated constantly, and that vein was known to manage with the aggressive inflexibility that had been one of the less admired aspects of his commercial character. She told him that the conversation had become heated, that Vane had been dismissive and contemptuous in the way he had been contemptuous with people he did not consider worth his full attention, and that in the course of the argument she had struck him and he had fallen, and she had understood immediately that the fall was worse than she had intended, and she had panicked, and she had taken the money from the strongbox because she had not known what else to do, and she had left by the back entrance. She told all of this without crying and without trembling, and with the specific, terrible composure of a woman who has decided that the composure is necessary, and is maintaining it by the full force of everything she is. Hart listened to her with the careful attention of a man who is taking notes in his mind, while presenting a face of neutral professional reception, and who is assessing, behind that face, the plausibility of what he is hearing and the character of the person saying it. He asked her why she had not come forward sooner. She said she had been frightened, and that the frightening of herself had been a cowardice she was ashamed of, and that she was here now. He asked her where the money from the strongbox was. She said she had spent a portion of it in the 3 days since, and that the remainder was at her house. This was not true. She had spent the previous night making it true, drawing on the household's small savings, on the money she kept in the tin box in the linen cupboard that Robert did not know the full extent of, on every source available to her, to assemble an amount that was plausible as the portion remaining from what Vane's strongbox was understood to have contained. She had given herself one night to make the story hold, and she had used every minute of it. Hart said he would need to verify the money. She said she understood and gave him her address and told him when Robert would not be at home, because one of the several things she had decided in the kitchen while the kettle boiled was that Robert could not know, not yet, not until she had no alternative, because Robert's response to knowing would be to intervene, and the intervention of a husband in 1748 Colonial Carolina, however well-intentioned, would complicate what she was doing in ways she could not afford. Hart came to the house the following morning. He verified the money. He asked several more questions, each of which she had anticipated and prepared for, and she answered each one with the precision of a woman who has spent a night building a structure and is now presenting it as though it grew there naturally. When he was finished, he told her, with the formal courtesy of a man performing an unpleasant official duty, that he was placing her under arrest for the death of Cornelius Vane and the theft of his property, and that she would be held pending the convening of the Colonial Court, which sat quarterly and whose next session was in 6 weeks. She nodded and asked if she could have a few minutes to write a note for her husband. Hart, who was not without human feeling whatever the official nature of his role required, said she could. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote 2 notes. The first was to Robert, telling him that she had done something she needed to answer for and that she loved him, and that she was sorry for what this was going to cost him, and that she needed him to trust her. The second note she sealed and addressed to Grace and wrote on its outside, in her careful hand, the instruction that it was not to be opened until after whatever was coming was finished. She gave both notes to Hart and asked him to ensure they were delivered. He said he would. Grace received her note and did not open it. She did not open it because the instruction not to open it until after whatever was coming was finished was an instruction from her mother, and Grace Aldcott did not disobey her mother's specific instructions, not even when the specific instruction was costing her more than she had the resources to measure. She held the sealed letter in both hands on the evening after Miriam was taken to the Colonial jail, and she sat in the kitchen of the house that was now missing the person who had always been its center, and she felt the full weight of something she did not yet understand and could not ask about, and she held it the way her mother had always taught her to hold difficult things, which was to hold them fully and not look away from them, and trust that the holding was possible because it had to be. Robert was not as contained as Grace. Robert, who was a man of genuine kindness and limited perceptiveness, and a love for his wife that was as complete as it was uncomplicated, went to Magistrate Hart within hours of receiving Miriam's note, and told him that his wife had not done what she said she had done, and that he wanted to speak with her. Hart told him that his wife had made a statement, and that the statement was a matter of official record, and that the court would hear the case in 6 weeks, and that the appropriate time for whatever Robert wanted to say was at the court proceeding. Robert was not satisfied with this. Robert came home and sat in the kitchen and looked at Grace and said he needed to understand what was happening. Grace told him she did not know. This was as true as anything she said in those 6 weeks. She did not know. She knew what her mother had done, she understood the shape of it, she understood the mechanism, and she understood the cost, and she understood, with the understanding that her mother had always said came from knowing her, what the reason was. What she did not know was why. She did not know what had happened on the night of the 13th of September, and she did not know what her mother knew or believed or had decided. And the not knowing was the thing she carried through those 6 weeks in the specific way of a person, carrying something whose weight they cannot fully measure because they cannot see its full extent. She went to the jail. She was permitted to visit, under the colony's practice regarding prisoners awaiting trial, and she went every second day and sat across from her mother in the visiting room, which was a small bare chamber with a table between them and a guard at the door. And she sat with Miriam, and they talked about ordinary things, about the house and the harbor and the season and Robert's work, and the small details of daily life that had always been the texture of their conversation. Miriam did not speak about the case. She did not speak about what was coming. She asked about Grace's health and Grace's sleep, and whether Grace was eating properly, the specific questions of a mother whose attention to her child's welfare does not relax because the mother is in jail awaiting trial for murder. Grace asked her once, directly, sitting across the table in the bare visiting room on a Thursday afternoon in October, why she had done it. Miriam looked at her daughter for a long moment with the full weight of the maternal knowing that had been the ground beneath Grace's entire life, the knowledge that had always been there whether Grace was aware of it or not, the love that had taken the form, in this instance, of the most terrible and the most complete thing it had ever been asked to take. She said nothing. She reached across the table and took Grace's hand and held it in both of hers and said nothing. And Grace, who understood her mother better than she understood most things, understood from the silence and the holding that the question had been answered as fully as it was going to be answered in that room on that afternoon, and she did not ask again. The Colonial Court convened in November of 1748. It was a proceeding of 3 days, conducted by a judge sent from Charlestown, a man named Judge Aldous Prentice, who was a man of the law in the full sense, thorough and fair within the framework of what the law was, which meant fair within a framework that was not itself entirely fair, but that Prentice administered without cruelty, and without the specific corruption that made some colonial proceedings worse than they needed to be. Miriam's confession was the primary evidence. It was supported by Hart's testimony about her voluntary presentation and the money found at her house, and the specific details of her account that were consistent with the physical evidence of the scene in Vane's study. Edmund Wraith gave his testimony about the figure he had observed leaving the Vane property, and his testimony was accepted with the weight that testimony from a man of his standing was given in the Colonial Court, which was more weight than it deserved and considerably more than the testimony of a woman of Miriam's standing would have received if she had denied the charge. The defense was limited. Robert had found an attorney, a man named Mr. Henry Calder, who was the best available in the circumstances, and who was not very good in the absolute sense, but who was what there was. Calder challenged the reliability of Wraith's observation on the grounds of the darkness of the evening and the distance from which it was made. He presented character witnesses from Miriam, neighbors and church-going acquaintances who spoke to her honesty and her gentleness and her standing in the community, and who were heard with the respectful inattention that character witnesses typically receive when there is a confession on the record. He noted the absence of physical evidence connecting Miriam specifically to the blow that killed Vane, which was true, but which the prosecution addressed by pointing to the confession as its own evidence of presence and action. Miriam sat through all of this with the composed attention of a woman who is listening to her own story being told, and who has decided that the story is going to be told this way and is at peace with that decision. She did not waver. She did not add to what she had said or subtract from it. She answered the questions put to her in cross-examination with the careful precision of a woman who has constructed something and is maintaining its integrity under pressure. And the precision was, paradoxically, part of what made the jury believe her, because the wavering and the inconsistency that characterize false testimony were simply absent. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of manslaughter, not murder, a distinction that Calder had argued for on the basis of the absence of premeditation in Miriam's account, and that the jury had accepted, which was the one mitigation in an outcome that had very few. The sentence for manslaughter in the Colonial Carolina court of 1748 was not death. It was transportation or indentured service, at the court's discretion, for a period of years determined by the severity of the case. Judge Prentice, who had listened to 3 days of evidence and who had formed, across those 3 days, an assessment of Miriam Aldcott that he kept entirely to himself, because it was not the kind of assessment that could be expressed in the official record, sentenced her to 7 years of indentured service, to be served in the colony. She was 39 years old. Grace received the sentence in the courtroom with the stillness that had become her habitual mode across the 6 weeks since her mother had been taken to the jail, the stillness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that their body has adjusted to the weight, that the carrying has become the posture rather than the imposition. Robert, sitting beside her, made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but was something between them, the sound of a man whose understanding of the world has been reorganized without his consent. Miriam was taken from the courtroom to begin her service. The family to which she was assigned was a household 12 miles north of Tidebell, a farm family of the middling sort whose need for household labor was genuine, and whose treatment of that labor was, by the standards of the institution, not the worst available. Miriam worked their house and their kitchen and their dairy with the complete competence of a woman who has managed a household for 20 years, and who brings that competence to the new situation, not because the new situation deserves it, but because competence is how she meets all situations, because it is what she has, and she uses what she has. She was permitted to write and to receive letters. She wrote to Grace every 2 weeks, letters that were about the ordinary things and that never contained a word about why, not because the why was absent, but because the letter was not the place for it, because the letter could be read by others, and because the why, in any case, was something Grace already knew in the way that a person knows the thing they have not been told, because the not telling is itself a kind of telling. She asked about Grace's health and Grace's sleep, and whether Grace was eating properly, the specific questions of a mother whose attention to her child's welfare does not relax because they are separated by 12 miles and 7 years of an unjust sentence. Grace wrote back every 2 weeks. She ran the Aldcott house. She managed Robert, who had aged 10 years in 6 weeks, and who was a man at sea in the literal sense that the harbor where he worked had become foreign to him, its familiarity a reproach rather than a comfort. The place where he had lived his life for 30 years, now the place where his wife's absence was most present because the harbor was Tidebell and Tidebell was the life they had built, and the life they had built was built around Miriam, and without Miriam it did not hold its shape the same way. Grace managed him with the same patient, unannounced competence that Miriam had always managed everything, because she had learned from the best available teacher, and the lesson had been comprehensive. She also thought about Edmund Wraith. She thought about him constantly, in the specific way of a person who has identified the mechanism of an injustice and who is working out, with the patience and the intelligence that her mother had always said were her most important qualities, What can be done about it? She did not act immediately. Acting immediately would have been the Grace of 19, the Grace who moved toward things with her whole self before she had fully understood them. She was now the Grace of 20, and the 6 weeks of her mother's imprisonment, and the 3 days of the trial, and the sentence, and the 12 miles of separation had aged her in ways that 19 years had not, and the aging had produced a quality she had not possessed before, which was the specific patience of a person who has something important to do and understands that doing it well is more important than doing it quickly. She watched Wraith. She watched him the way her mother had taught her to watch things, which was with the full attention of a person who is learning rather than the partial attention of a person who already believes they know what they are seeing. She watched him in the harbor and in the town's commercial spaces, and in the social occasions where both of them were present, and she built, over months and then over years, a detailed and specific understanding of Edmund Wraith that was considerably more complete than the understanding she had had at 18 when his attention had flattered her, and she had not yet seen what was beneath it. She understood, from watching him and from listening to the people who dealt with him commercially, and from the careful reading of the harbor records that were publicly available, that Wraith's commercial position, which had appeared solid in the years when she had first known him, was less solid than it appeared. He had made commitments that his operations income was not reliably meeting. He had borrowed from merchants in Charlestown, whose patience with the borrowing was not inexhaustible. He was a man whose respectable surface was, like many such surfaces in colonial commercial life, maintained at a cost that was gradually exceeding the means available to maintain it. She also understood, from a source she had cultivated with great patience over the course of 2 years, that Wraith's testimony about what he had observed on the night of the 13th of September was not what he had presented it as. The source was a man named Abel Pratt, who worked in the harbor and who had been in Wraith's company on the evening of the 13th, and who had his own reasons that Grace had spent considerable time understanding and then addressing, for preferring not to have drawn attention to where he and Wraith had been that evening. Abel Pratt had not been at a distance from the Vane property when Wraith claimed to have observed a figure leaving it. He had been inside the Vane property with Wraith. She did not have proof of this in a form that a court would accept. She had Abel Pratt's account, given to her in private, in a conversation that had taken 2 years of careful relationship building to make possible, and Abel Pratt was not a man whose account would be received well in a court, being a man of limited standing and several minor legal infractions, and a willingness to change his account depending on which direction the pressure was coming from. What she had was enough to understand the full shape of what had happened on the night of the 13th of September, which was that Edmund Wraith had known exactly what he would find at the Vane property, because he had put it there, and that the naming of Grace had been the removal of an inconvenient witness, and the exercise of the claim he had been holding since April under a single efficient action. She spent the 3rd year of her mother's sentence building the case that the available evidence could support. She did not attempt to prove Wraith guilty, because the evidence for guilt was in Abel Pratt's account, and Abel Pratt's account could not be the foundation of a legal case without Abel Pratt's cooperation, which she had not yet secured and might never secure fully. What she built was a case for her mother's innocence, which was a different and more achievable thing. She found 3 inconsistencies in the physical evidence of the Vane study that had not been developed at trial, because Calder had not had the resources or the thoroughness to develop them. Inconsistencies that suggested the scene had been arranged rather than discovered in the state the struggle had left it. Inconsistencies that a careful reading of Hart's original investigation notes, which were public record, and which Grace had read with the attention she gave to all documents of importance, made visible to a person who knew what they were looking for. She wrote to Judge Prentice in Charlestown. She wrote him a careful, specific letter that presented the inconsistencies without making the accusation she could not prove, that asked for a review of the original evidence on the basis of matters not adequately explored at trial, that was written in the language of someone who has read enough legal documents to understand how legal documents work, and who uses that understanding not to perform legal sophistication, but to communicate clearly in the terms that the recipient of the letter was equipped to receive. Prentice received the letter. He was a man who had formed an assessment of Miriam Aldcott across 3 days of trial that he had kept entirely to himself, because it was not the kind of assessment that could be expressed in the official record. The letter from Miriam's daughter, written with a precision and a specificity that surprised him, gave him the mechanism he had not had in November of 1748 for doing something with the assessment he had been carrying since then. He initiated a review. The review took 8 months, conducted from Charlestown through correspondence and the dispatching of a junior officer of the court to Tidebell to examine the original evidence and interview the original witnesses. The review found, on the basis of Grace's identified inconsistencies, and several additional ones that the court's officer found in the course of his examination, that the physical evidence of the vein study was not consistent with the account given in the confession and not consistent with the events as originally presented to the court. The review found that the investigation had relied too heavily on the confession and too lightly on the physical evidence, and that the physical evidence, examined properly, raised sufficient doubt about the confession's accuracy to warrant a reconsideration of the verdict. Edmund Wraith left Tidebell in the spring of the 4th year of Miriam's sentence. He left quietly, without announcement, the specific departure of a man who has understood that the ground beneath him is shifting and who prefers to move before it gives way entirely. Abel Pratt, who had watched Wraith's departure from the harbor on a cold March morning, with the expression of a man watching something that has a direct bearing on his own situation, came to Grace's house 3 days later and sat in the kitchen and told her everything. He told her because Wraith was gone and could not protect him, and because Grace was the only person in Tidebell who had treated him as a human being whose account was worth hearing in the 2 years she had been carefully building toward this conversation, and because the account, at this point, was safer given than withheld. She had Abel Pratt's full testimony written up and witnessed by 2 members of the Tidebell community, whose standing was unimpeachable, and sent to Judge Prentice in Charlestown with a covering letter that was the most important document she had ever written. She was 23 years old. Prentice moved with a speed that surprised her, though in retrospect it should not have, because a man who has been carrying an assessment for 4 years and has just been given the mechanism to act on it moves with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting. He issued an order vacating the conviction. He issued a further order for the immediate release from indenture of Miriam Aldcott. He wrote to Grace, briefly and formally, that the court had found sufficient grounds to overturn the original verdict and that her mother would be returned to Tidebell within the fortnight. Grace sat in the kitchen with Prentice's letter in her hands, and the afternoon light coming through the window and the harbor sounds of the working day outside, and she felt something that she had not felt in 4 years, which was the specific and overwhelming sensation of a weight being lifted that has been present for so long that its absence is almost as disorienting as its presence had been. Miriam came home on a Thursday morning in the autumn of 1752, 4 years and 3 weeks after she had walked out of this house to go to Magistrate Hart's office and tell him a story she had prepared in one night at the kitchen table. She was 43 years old. She looked 4 years older than 43 in some ways and 4 years younger in others, older in the way of a person who has worked hard in difficult conditions, younger in the way of a person who has been released from something they have been carrying, and who has not yet fully registered that the carrying is over. Grace was standing at the door when the cart came up the road and stopped in front of the house, and she walked down the path, and Miriam stepped down from the cart, and they stood in the road in front of the house, and held each other without speaking for a long time, the 2 of them, mother and daughter, in the autumn morning light of a Carolina coastal town that had taken something from them, and from which they had taken it back. Robert came out of the house and stood on the path looking at his wife and his daughter in the road, and made the sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, the same sound he had made in the courtroom 4 years before, and this time it meant something entirely different. That evening, when Robert was asleep and the house was quiet and the harbor was dark outside, and the last of the day's light had long since gone, Grace brought Miriam a cup of tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and placed the sealed letter on the table between them. The letter Miriam had written in Hart's office 4 years before. The letter addressed to Grace that was not to be opened until after whatever was coming was finished. Miriam looked at the letter and then looked at Grace. Grace said she had not opened it. She said she had wanted to many times and she had not, because her mother had told her not to, and she had trusted her mother's judgment even when she did not understand it, which was a form of trust that was harder than the trust that comes with understanding and more valuable for being harder. Miriam picked up the letter and turned it over in her hands. It was worn at the edges from 4 years of Grace keeping it carefully, and the seal was intact, and she held it for a long time without speaking. Then she set it down and pushed it gently across the table to Grace and said she could open it now. Grace opened it carefully, pulling the wax seal intact so it remained in one piece, and unfolded the paper and read what her mother had written in Hart's office on the afternoon of 4 years before, in the minutes between his agreement to let her write and the moment he came to take her. The letter was short. It said, in Miriam's careful hand, that Grace must not blame herself for whatever was happening, because none of it was her fault and all of it was a mother's choice made freely. It said that the choice was the easiest one Miriam had ever made, even though it was the hardest one, because the easiest choices and the hardest ones are sometimes exactly the same thing. It said that Grace was the finest thing in her life, and that the finest things in a life are worth any cost, and that the cost, whatever it turned out to be, was not a sacrifice in the way that word is usually meant, the way it implies loss and deprivation, and the giving up of something wanted. It was not that. It was the most complete expression of what she was, of what she had always been since the morning Grace had come into the world in the upper room of this house, and the expression of what you are at your most essential is not a sacrifice. It is simply the fullest version of yourself, offered in the moment that required it. It said, "Do not grieve for me. Be what you have always been. That is all I have ever wanted." Grace sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands for a long time. Miriam sat across from her and drank her tea and looked at her daughter, and did not fill the silence because the silence did not need filling. Outside the harbor was dark and the night was quiet, and the Atlantic moved against the Carolina coast, the way it had always moved, and the way it would always move, indifferent and magnificent and completely itself, the way the things that endure are always completely themselves, unchanged by the storms that pass over them and unchanged by the calms that follow. Miriam Aldcott was home. She had come home from the only place a woman like her could have gone, which was the furthest point of the furthest thing she was capable of, straight through the worst of what the world had and out the other side, brought back not by anything the world had decided to do, but by the daughter she had done it for. The letter sat open on the kitchen table between them. The candle burned. The harbor was quiet. The night held them both, mother and daughter, in the particular and irreplaceable warmth of a kitchen that has known love for a long time and that holds the shape of it in its walls and its table, and its fire the way old wood holds warmth, from the inside out, long after the source of it has moved on. This was the shape of what a mother will carry. This was the weight of it and the cost of it and the absolute, uncalculating love that makes the carrying not only possible but inevitable. The love that does not ask whether it can bear the thing before it bears it. The love that simply bears it because the alternative is unthinkable, and the unthinkable has never, in the entire history of mothers and their children, been sufficient reason for a mother to stop.